Yeah, so I'm Vera. I've just ended my second year as a PhD student in Reading, and well, the title of my dissertation is also the title of the paper I put forward. It's this kind of side project to my overall PhD, so if you're interested in that, you can ask about that afterwards. I'm going to quickly introduce what kind of problem I'm interested in the paper and in this presentation. Set out the question I posed in the paper as well. Then the analysis of how we can go about answering this particular question, and my preliminary conclusions to that. Now we can go to the discussant, Nimrod. So I'm concerned with loss of ecosystem resilience in this paper, and it is characterized as the increased difficulty of a natural system to recover from disturbances, which happens among other occasions in approach of a tipping point. I'm particularly interested in this issue in relation to climate change, where climate change affects resilience negatively and loss of resilience feed back into the climate system. And ecosystem cycles have in and outputs of which humanity is set to benefit in major economic and societal ways. Resilience of ecosystems and social systems is in this way, I think, inextricably linked. The preservation of these functions can thus be argued from among other standpoints, a socio-economic perspective. Is it a fatal risk, the loss of ecosystem resilience? I put a question mark there because I don't think I quite cracked the concept of being a fatal risk. But just let's look at it as a significant risk which is worth our attention in politics. So attention usually seems to go out to risks generally perceived to be very grave, the ones that are likely to happen and the ones that will be most costly, maybe both monetarily and more broadly speaking in terms of loss of or effort to prevent or adapt to. With this weight being given to costly side of the spectrum of risks, many other arguably significant risks that are less well understood will be overshadowed. Loss of ecosystem resilience often proves to be such a risk. Public awareness of ecosystem degradation and the gravity of its possible consequences is limited, and the issue often does not make it onto the political agenda. So the question I had in this paper is how should we address the issue of loss of ecosystem resilience in the context of climate change governance. So this leads us into the question of how to evaluate loss of ecosystem resilience. As a means of dealing with the risks involved with climate change, economic tools are often called upon to partly determine the right course of political action, and cost-benefit analysis is one of the measures most widely used in policymaking. And for problems relating to ecosystems, the framework of ecosystem services is often enlisted. However, ecosystems and their functions have evolved for over billions of years of evolution and work in very intricate ways that are poorly understood. So the recommendation of ecologists to have regard for this complexity and diversity is understandable, but in a world where the principle of simplicity seems to rule, especially in science, this is problematic. And so, until we know what is important, we have, from an economic perspective at least, no reason to attribute any value to any part of nature, it seems. Even if we do hold the knowledge of a service's importance, there is no guarantee that we can assign it the proper value that will cover the true cost, the true worth of nature. And it also becomes increasingly hard to put a value on potential commodities, and as tragedy would have it, the functioning of ecosystems only becomes apparent to us and their value through their degradation. So scientific uncertainty and ignorance is therefore a great limitation to this what I would call economic approach of ecosystem services framework and cost-benefit analysis, and doesn't seem to me to be the route to take. Alternatively, there are other and most predominantly non-anthropocentric ways of expressing the value of nature proposed in philosophy, stressing the intrinsic value of nature, in which all living organisms have a moral worth, independent of their relationships to other organisms. I, however, foresee some problems here with regards to ecosystems, and as I understand intrinsic value to be necessarily a form of value ascribed by a phenomenon to itself, as it is ascribed irrespective of external relationships. It is therefore questionable that plants and ecosystems can have this intrinsic value, according to this conception, as they seem to lack the sentient or cognitive awareness. So this seems to pull us back towards the direction of anthropocentric ways of valuing nature, which is often frowned upon in environmental philosophy debates. But I would say there's nothing essentially wrong with a stance like this. After all, the cognitive ability of valuing we only know intimately from our human perspective. It would, however, be indefensible to jump to the conclusion that the only morally relevant beings are humans, and this way is this is the way that anthropocentrism is characterized most often. It would also be erroneous to conclude that phenomena we know to value are the only things that are actually valuable, because humans are also notorious for making value misjudgments. Here it might be worth to make a distinction I was toying with in this paper of instrumental and potential value, where instrumental value is the demonstrable value and the potential value denotes a value in nature that we are yet unaware of. Resilience is then not only of instrumental value as a means to protect us from prospective harm, but also of potential value, since it creates a form of insurance against possible disturbances we cannot foresee but still might occur. So what's the alternative to cost-benefit analysis and ecosystem services approaches then? If it needs to refrain from putting a burden of proof on precise predictions, or needs to refrain from being too abstract in its evaluation processes. Oh, sorry. One such alternative, which is proposed by people involved in policymaking, is abiding by the precautionary principle. And Steve Gardner has already used this as this definition, this formulation of the precautionary principle, and it states that when substantial evidence indicates that an activity threatens human health or the environment, take precautionary measures to prevent or reduce such harm, even if some of the cause and effect relationships are not well established scientifically. This is one of the, I think, the most neutral versions of the precautionary principle you can find, in that it doesn't seem to presuppose any particular approaches of how to go about taking precautions. But even though the precautionary principle has a wide variety of interpretations and formulations, I would argue that it at least has includes a statement about harm avoidance being the precautionary principle's partial objective. It seems to take a stance on the level of knowledge sufficient for making precautionary decisions, and puts forward a view on what precautionary principle should aim to achieve in society. However, the role of the precautionary principle is controversial, and its relation to other ways of going about policy making including risk analysis and cost-benefit analysis, is often put into question as well, how it relates to those. So risk analysis and the precautionary principle can be considered operative in two different domains, where risk analysis occupies the domain of probability and the PP is excluded from this, occupying the domain of uncertainty. On the other hand, risk analysis is said to play a part in determining uncertainty, and this is what links it to the precautionary principle. And then risk analysis can be said to be a quantified guide to making precautionary decisions. Underlying this stark divide between, or the intertwinement of the precautionary principle and these more quantified approaches, are assumptions as to what sort of knowledge we can expect to gather and how weighty this knowledge then is. They are essentially underpinned by epistemological assumptions. The view dividing the precautionary principle and RA seems to assume that uncertainty can altogether be eliminated by ascribing a probability to the occurrence of an event, whereas the one intertwining precautionary principle and risk analysis seems to assume that uncertainty is ever pervasive. To accept that uncertainty is either reducible or pervasive has repercussions in our treatment of risk and in our use of the precautionary principle. The conception that uncertainty is reducible can ultimately, I fear, lead to policymakers taking a hesitant stance on acting on preliminary results, indicating a risk will develop in the future. Whereas the conception that uncertainty is to an extent irreducible will most probably have us reflect on the level of knowledge necessary to take a more proactive stance and take action. Moreover, postponing taking actions on issues to do with loss of ecosystem resilience specifically, but also climate change in general, will most likely exacerbate the gravity of the risks and leave us with a limited time frame to tackle them by. Gambling with these diminishing time frames and impactful matters like these can be deemed highly irresponsible and even immoral. So my philosophical defense of following a precautionary principle on a bigger or broader scope is therefore, I think, to be expected. In the context of loss of ecosystem resilience, it is even more obviously a case of endorsing the PP in this broader sense, as the general perception is that the relevant science to ecosystem degradation is highly uncertain. So how then should we interpret the precautionary principle? I think virtue ethics might be able to inform us how we should cultivate a proper precautionary stance. And I focus on three core themes in virtue ethics that might help us out here. So flourishing, or eudaimonia, would be that we acknowledge that we are both rational and emotional animals, and this can be described as a necessary form of self-understanding, and we need to balance these two sides in order to make virtuous choices. In addition to this, we would have to understand human beings as social animals, animals that need the community in order to live a flourishing life. Then prudence, or phronesis, could be seen. The obtainment of prudence can only be done by acquiring contextual knowledge relevant to a great variety of situations and can only be gained through experience. This contextual knowledge consists of both theoretical and practical input, and it is, in essence, as philosopher Rosalind Hursthout would describe, worldly knowledge. This consists of the knowledge of the workings and status quo of the world, of the method to cultivating virtues, and the ability to reflect and potentially change the course of your life. This virtue can be recognized then in other people, as these persons can be labeled as phronimoi, or wise people that lead by example. And the needed virtues, I'll come back to this to these two virtues I name here, humility and courage, but with needed, I simply mean that these character traits, these virtues, might prove to be especially crucial to act upon and cultivate, given the current state of the world we live in. Then evolutionary biology might be able to inform us what it actually means to flourish as a human being in a more profound way. It would have us consider the evolved limitations of the environment, because there seems to be a reason why things evolve the way they have, as a state of being might be optimal considering the circumstances. And biology suggests that during our upbringing as human beings, we need to acquire this knowledge of our surrounding area to interact with it effectively. So the knowledge and experience-based knowledge of the world around us is important in our survival. The community and the individual seem to be important in evolutionary comes from research in evolutionary biology. And in Charles Darwin's work, you can see that he has explanations of both social and selfish behavior in human beings. Where we on the one hand see how other organisms are closely related to us and we feel this affiliation towards them, but we also display individualistic and selfish behaviour for survival at the expense of others. However, recent research has suggested that there's more of a base for social cooperation and empathy, and empathy in biology is then defined as the ability to assess the reason for the emotional state of another and adopting their perspective, and to be affected by and share the state of the other. And this is presented in biology as a driving force behind social behaviour, and it might also arguably underpin our moral systems. This might be a big leap, but it's all preliminary, so I just wanted to put it out there. So virtue ethics and evolutionary biology to me seem to have both acknowledged that improving behaviour can be done by learning through experience, trial and error. They stress that what is considered moral is subject to both cognition and emotional response. And they see an important role reserved for the copying of another's behaviour that will ultimately benefit the self and the community. I believe that by promoting an ethical theory that is rooted in this conception of human and nature more broadly, ethicists might come up with a method of getting more and more people involved in pursuing what is considered environmentally moral. So it says something about the feasibility, maybe, hopefully. By acknowledging that evolution underpins almost all systems in the world, we might awaken a form of respect or even empathy in humanity that will promote the consideration of natural systems as a morally right thing to do. Evolution shows us that everything has a rich history, that has caused things to develop as intricately as they have, and to disrupt this largely unexplored historical intricacy and trying to replace it by new systems that are less adapted may very well be unwise and incautious. This can inform interpretation of the precautionary principle, I would say. The combination of virtue ethics and evolutionary biology might ensure that we attempt to make a precautionary attitude into a habit by taking measures to maintain the workings of the evolved systems and demand a respect for their intricacies stemming from co-evolved interactions between organisms, be it human or non-human, and their environment. The virtues I think we currently are mostly in need of cultivating could be humility and courage. We need to acquire a humble attitude with respect to the limits of our knowledge and the acknowledgement of human dependence on natural systems. The precautionary principle can potentially prescribe just that to policymakers, in that we need to give due consideration to preliminary results in science. That has been ignored largely in climate change governance. We need to acquire a courageous attitude in speaking out about and taking action on early warning signs of prospective harm, being a whistleblower of sorts, and instigating the systemic change that is needed to adequately address the threats posed to us by climate change and its aftermath. The precautionary principle can potentially prescribe just that to members of academia and maybe the broader public, in that we need to protect whistleblowers and be open to adaptation of our societies that have been so damaging to ecosystem resilience in the past. So to come to the conclusions, I hope to have shown that loss of ecosystem resilience is a significant, albeit overshadowed, risk worthy of our attention in politics. The economic approach might have serious shortcomings, and that the precautionary principle might be able to step in as an alternative here. Virtue ethics might be able to inform us how we cultivate a proper precautionary stance, and evolutionary biology might give us a thicker idea of what it means to flourish as human beings.